Good. So thank you very much for the invitation to this conference and to talk about the topic that has been in the news for lately and has been quite a hot topic. And to discuss the challenges on actually managing mold in buildings. So this one. So what you see here on the right is my room when I was studying architecture. This is many, many years ago. And I used to live with my parents and they have a basement. And I decided to convert that basement in my workshop, my space with my table, my bed. And I lived in that space for around 8 months until I developed some asthma allergy to something, okay? I went to the doctor. So before going that, sorry, I forgot. So when this mold started to appear in my room, I felt extremely lucky because I was living in an environment with nature. So my approach to mold wasn't to clean it or actually to remove it, was to paint it around, something similar to what you see and that artist that developed this and create these carpets based on lichen and mold. But anyway, going back, so I developed this allergy to something. So I went to the doctor. The doctor said, you know what, you have an allergy to humidity. It wasn't actually mold. So I have to move from that room. Now, many years later, I came to the UK to study the health impact of buildings. And luckily for me, in my department at UCL, they were doing a revision of approved document F, specifically the ventilation and humidity. And it was given as a task to me to check if actually what was in this approved document F was correct. So my whole PhD was to look at mold. And as an architect, well, you have to go in a different dimension. You start to look at microbiology, trying to understand mold from its basis. So the first thing that I did is to try to understand when the problem of mold started. And what I found is literature from my colleagues and professors at my university that actually the first time that mold was reported was in the book of Leviticus. And probably many of you have heard of this. If not, well, let me know. And it's a book of Leviticus from the Old Testament. Now, this was really interesting to me because I was just thinking, well, the book of Leviticus talk about the land of Canaan, where Israel is at the moment. And at that time, many, many, many years ago, how was the climate? What kind of buildings actually they used to have in these places, and how people used to use the buildings. So I was just thinking, well, it doesn't make sense that mold was reported on the Old Testament. Mold, something so insignificant, is reported in the Old Testament. So what the Old Testament talk about, and the book of Leviticus, is about the purity, okay? Talk about things that are pure and things that are impure, and how you can get closer to God with the help of a priest. So there is a few sentences in the book of the Leviticus that talk and mention if something appears, a defect appears in your building walls, which is going to be reddish and yellowish, you need to remove it. Call a priest, and the priest is going to help you remove it. And if the problem persists, what you need to do is just knock down the house. So I wasn't convinced that this was correct. So I contacted a friend who brought me an Old Testament written in Hebrew. And actually, what they referred to in the Old Testament is to leprosy, okay, which is a really scary disease at the time. And it's wrongly translated to English as mold. So I started to think, okay, when actually I continued doing my research, and I found that, again, wrongly, mold was associated with diphtheria, which is was a really common disease in Europe and in the UK, that at that time was called the Chilean plague, but again, wrongly, okay? And it was much later, in the early 20th century, when actually mold started to be associated with some diseases, in this case, asthma, and much later when actually all the research on mold and health started to appear. And not just respiratory illnesses, but also non-respiratory symptoms like fatigue and other difficulties, concentration. So Yes, it's a current problem. It's not an old problem. Sorry. It has been reported in many surveys in the UK. The first one is 1991, the English House Condition Survey, that reported the first time that they talk about mold. 10 million homes in the UK were affected by mold. It has been always reported with condensation and damp. So we don't know actually if it's just mold, is it damp or condensation problems. But if you see there's a different English House Condition Service reported it during the many years since 1986. And the numbers, the percentage of homes affected by mold has decreased with time. One of the latest one, 2019, report that only 3% of homes actually are affected by mold. This is completely contradictory with what Shelter said, that is 50%. And after the case of this boy that died in 2020 in Manchester, actually many local councils and local authority can come with levels that are much higher. So about 60% of homes affected by mold. So it is a current problem, and it's a problem that is not just in the UK. If you start to look at the literature, is a problem in Northern European countries, in African countries, especially in the South, Australia, China. Like, for example, this study that we were looking with a student on trying to understand how big is the problem of mold in China, but only focusing on papers written in Chinese, not in English. South America, the US, etc. So it's a massive worldwide problem. Now, as we know, mold can have a huge effect on the aesthetic of the buildings, but also have a cost on maintaining. And this cost is not just on repairing buildings affected by mold, which is a lot of money, but also on legal cases and on dealing with people that is, from a health point of view, affected by mold. And one thing that we don't know yet much is that mold is not just affecting physical health, but also mental health. And that is something that requires a lot more attention and research. Now, what are we dealing with? And this is because I started to look at mold, and at some point I was quite happy that I was living in an environment with mold. My approach to mold has been always, okay, let me try to understand, because it cannot be that is so bad, okay? So it's really important when we look at mold, try to understand what we're dealing with. So as you probably know, mold play an extremely important role in our life. They break down organic materials. And they have been in history, they have played a really important role in the Second World War when the penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming. Also, there are many products that we eat that are created with mold. As you can see here, Stilton cheese, Roquefort cheese, Spanish chorizo, and for those that like miso soup or soya sauce. They're all made from different mold species. But when they arrive in homes and they start to grow in home, it's really important, and this is what I'm saying, that for me, mold, it shouldn't be seen as something that wrong. For me, mold is a messenger, okay? You need to think that when you wake up in the morning and suddenly you have some temperature, and you take your temperature, you have a bit of fever, you said, okay, something is wrong, but you don't know what, okay? You need to think with mold the same. If mold is happening in a home, or is growing a home, means that something is wrong with that home. So mold is the symptom of something that is wrong. And this is extremely important because at the moment, many housing providers and local authorities are dealing with mold, just cleaning it, but they're not doing appropriate diagnostics trying to understand what is the cause of mold. So this is when it comes the idea of balance. It's the same with the body. There's something that is unbalanced, something that is affecting my health. So I need to do a proper diagnostic. Now, what is that? What is really affecting the balance of my home? Sorry, and I need to understand, okay, what is creating the mold? I mean, what are the conditions that are appropriate for mold to grow? And here we need to understand that there are three main life cycle stages for mold. You have mold spores, which at the moment we're all breeding. This room is full of mold spores, different species, okay? And we're all breeding. I came this morning from London. I'm pretty sure in my way here, I am having, mold in mold spores in my cloth, and I'm sharing with you. Now, when those spores get to a surface that has the proper conditions, is going to start to grow. And the first thing is germination. So something is going to appear that this spore is going to crack, and a small branch or arm is going to appear, and this is called germination. And then that brand is going to start to expand, is going to create a body, and this is called a mycelium. So each one of these three, they require different environmental conditions. So what you see here is an animation of a spore getting a surface and then suddenly starting to develop, and then sporulation when they produce more spores. Now, for mold to develop, there are different environmental parameters that are required, but the most important is water, okay, humidity. And we all know, we are all familiar with relative humidity, and this is what we measure in our homes. But actually what we should be looking at is the concept called water activity, which is the amount of water available on surfaces, on materials. And that is the critical aspect. Now, what you see in the right-hand side of the slide is an isopleth, a graph that shows different, let me see if I can show you here, different mold species, and in that axis you see relative humidity, and on the bottom axis you see temperature. So what it shows you that different mold species, they need different environmental, different condition of level of water and temperature to grow and to develop. Now, this is extremely important because if we go now to the 5 kingdoms, probably you remember this when you were at school, that exists these 5 kingdoms. Now in biology, they teach you 3. So you have plants, you have fungus, you have animals, you have Protista morena. And this is extremely important because if I ask you to name me one animal species, probably between all of us, we're going to be able to create a massive zoo, an amazing one, okay? And if I ask you to give me the name of a plant or a flower, probably all of you, you're going to give me the name of a flower, a lily, a rose, I don't know, an orchid. But if you see on the side over there, there are more than 26, or there are between 22,000 and 26,000 species of just orchids. But if I ask you to give me the names of the species of mold, I know that I have a few experts here because I just spot them. But in general, those that are not expert, will you be able to give me the name of 5 mold species? Yes, no? 2? No? 1? Okay. But that tells you how we can deal with the problem if we don't know the problem, okay? And this is extremely important. So there are many mold species, more than 1 million mold species and more than 10,000 mold genera. And you can see here the different mold spores and some of our experimental, mold that we are using in our labs. And I have just that image on the top just to show that it was found in the US that on food, only around 80 and 100 species that grow. So if you have some mold in your body, it could be any species, and probably all of us, we have different species growing in our bodies. So here is when it comes the idea of the moisture balance, okay? A home or a building is gonna be in constant balance, okay? Sometimes it's gonna be quite humid, sometimes it's gonna be dry, humid, dry. But if at some point get constantly humid, this is when we're breaking this balance, and is when mold is gonna start to grow. Now, what we are currently advising on how to deal with mold is stop water from entering the home, from brain penetration, from raising dam, etc. Reducing extra moisture being produced indoors. Proper heating, including obviously the improvement of the building envelope through energy efficiency, and providing efficient and consistent ventilation. And this, I guess, for all of you seems reasonable, is what we are doing. But this is when it comes to challenges, okay? Because this is not as simple. So the first thing is moisture production. So we're saying that we need to reduce the moisture production. And one of the big issues with the housing ombudsman, or one of the things that he highlighted, is that housing providers were just blaming residents on the mold problems, so human behavior. And so housing were blaming residents on the mold problem because of behavior. And this is what the housing ombudsman was saying, that this is completely wrong. However, there is some right on that. I mean, we all produce humidity at home and we all behave in a different way, but there is not enough information on how much moisture is produced. So if you look at the literature, most of the literature on moisture production is from the 70s. There is not much literature at the moment on how much moisture we produce, the body produces, etc. Now, there's not enough information on how people use their homes, how they ventilate, what are the heating regimes. And also, there's quite an important aspect here, thermal comfort. Do we really know how people, or why people feel comfortable, or why they feel uncomfortable? And that is quite critical when we start to look at human behavior. Now, all these factors, human behavior is also affected by other factors, in this case, fuel poverty, energy efficiency, and the heritage values. It's really complex for certain buildings to be refurbished and to be improved. And obviously that is going to have an impact on how people use their buildings. There is a lack of understanding on what a proper ventilation is. We all recommend you need to ventilate your home, open windows, or if you have a mechanical system, use the mechanical system. But that is quite complex because, as I said at the early, mold growth on surfaces. And when we look at ventilation, we're trying to remove the humidity from air. But how much humidity you need to provide to remove the humidity from surfaces? So that is something that there's no knowledge there. As I said at the beginning, my PhD was on mold, was to assess the part F, approved document F. And if you look at the approved document F, it just tells you what are the conditions that you need to prevent or from a relativity point of view to avoid mold growth. But it doesn't tell you, there is not a link between the ventilation and the humidity on surfaces. Anyway, there is a lack of understanding on what an effective heating means. We know that we need to increase the temperature to reduce relative humidity, but also increase the temperature to increase the temperature on surfaces, which means reducing the humidity and temperature. But how much you should do it, for how long? There's not much information. And obviously, these two, ventilation and heating, is quite a complex if we start to look at the climate. I mean, in this country, we have, and in the UK, there is so many different countries, just moving from 1 hour to another. I mean, traveling, you have completely different conditions. Materials. We are still trying to understand the properties of materials, okay? Every single material that we have in homes. And every year we're introducing new materials, and we don't know how those new materials are gonna actually affect the humidity within a building. Now, if we look outside, climate conditions, we don't have enough information on climate conditions and how we can use those climate conditions to predict, for example, more growth. And you need to think that everything here is not just the materials, the building, the internal conditions, behavior, and external condition. All this is quite dynamic, it's constantly changing. So how do we get that information to actually deal with mold? Research on mold, this is extremely critical. I mean, we want to deal with mold, but we don't know enough. How many species? What are the species that really grow in buildings? And what are the conditions that they need? As I said at the beginning, when I mentioned the reports on mold in the UK, every single survey uses a different standard or way of assessing and asking people about mold. Some of them, they show you a picture. Some of them, they ask you how severe the mold was. And others just ask, or surveyors were asking on the doors, do you have mold? And people, without knowing what the mold was saying, they said no, yes. So we need to do better ways of recording this data. And in terms of the health implication, the literature says that yes, there is a direct link between physical health, respiratory illnesses, and mold. But there are some literature that says that this is not that clear link. When we talk about mental health, that is a whole completely new dimension. There's not enough there. And finally, climate change. Well, there's going to be a movement achieved in temperature and relative humidity, and obviously that is creating new conditions. We're going to have a more frequent extreme events, more flooding, more rain, and obviously that's going to be quite favorably for mold. At the moment, we are trying to mitigate climate change by doing energy efficiency. But when doing energy efficiency, also you're creating unintended consequence, which is actually mold. There is a number of cases where by doing and improving the quality of the building, actually you have created other issues, in this case, related to mold. Like other species, animals and plants, mold adapt. So as climate is going to change, we're going to have new, existing mold that is going to adapt to new conditions. But also, probably we're going to have new species. Okay. At the moment, we know that Aspergillus, for example, is one of the common ones that we see in buildings. But in the future, we may have others. And finally, one of the things, I'm also academic director of the UK Motion Buildings. So it's a center where we try to improve the knowledge around everything related to motion in buildings, not just mold. I'm gonna invite you to look at our website. There is a lot of material that you can use with educational materials and tools. And you can also see the type of research that we are doing, which is actually research on each one of the areas that I show you on mold. So we are writing at the moment some proposals on mental health and mold. We're looking at mold and new methods through odor, so to try to smell mold, and by many other things around buildings. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer questions.